and emerging leaders. We have a good session, we hope, prepared for you for the next hour. If you recall, for those of you who were on our last webinar series session, we asked at the end, what were some of the HR topics that you would like us to cover? And so most of you provided some really good feedback. And the areas that were most repeated were the hire and probation period, performance management, progressive discipline, accommodations, and when to consult with HR. All of these, of course, are huge topics, and we could spend hours on each. What we hope to provide for you today is a beginning conversation, a starting point of how you might look at the HR issues that you are responsible for in the roles that you play on a regular basis. And so for today, we want to provide a bit of context. Why do managers, leaders that are not in HR need to know, or what do they need to know in terms of HR? We want to talk a little bit about legislation and how the courts view the employer and the employee relationship. Really important for you to have a good sense of that. And then we're going to do a short trip through the hire and probation period, progressive discipline, performance management, and accommodations. So we hope that this will provide practical tips of when to consult HR as well. So one of the things that's really important, we think, as you think about HR and working with different people in your organization that you're responsible for, is that real balance and the yin-yang almost of the relationship between, in terms of HR, of having a supportive role for staff and employees, and how critical that is for really positive experiences related to human resources. But then also understanding that your responsibility is also one of managing risk in relation to HR as well. So we hope today to be able to constantly think about situations from those two perspectives. How do you support an individual, but also how do you manage the risk of HR in your role as we go forward? So a few real practical things as we go through every time we start our webinar. In terms of ways to participate, we have the question or the question box that's available for you. You are now currently all muted, but you can unmute if you would like to speak. We will have interactive polls as we typically do. And again, raise your hand if you want to mute. There are people behind the scenes, Kathleen, who's watching out for that as well. A reminder that the way that you're going to get to the interactive polls is to go to the link. So I'll ask you to do that now. We won't start with a poll right away, but you'll have it open and ready for when we do. And on that link, on that page, that PDF, you're just going to click on that, but don't do that right now. You'll see that page and I'll point you to that when we get to that point through the process. So today, actually, Carrie is going to take the lead in our webinar, as she has extensive experience in HR, and she also just finished her Master's of Laws. So on that note, I will turn it over to Carrie to start our session and the content of our session.
Thanks so much, Maria. We're starting our title slide here. We're using a lot of floral imagery.
I think you might be muted, Carrie.
Oh, I should be unmuted. We're starting our session, or throughout our session today, we're using a lot of floral imagery.
Still can't hear you. Oh, that sounds like others can hear you. So go ahead, Carrie, sorry.
Thanks, Maria. In particular, because we're going to get into some of the very risk management side of things, and it's important to always remember that supportive side as well, that the work that you do in HR really is about helping people to flourish and thrive, and also the organization, helping the organization to grow and flourish and thrive. So as an introduction to that, we'll talk about that piece that is the supportive management practices. And Maria, I'm hoping you can move to our next slide. Thank you very much. So as we've talked about in sessions before, if staff do not know their expectations, they can't adhere to them and succeed in their role. So that's really one of the reasons that we have our policies, procedures as supportive practice. And if they aren't aware of when they've done something incorrect, they can't correct it. So you want to make sure, and we've talked about feedback, we've talked about all of these pieces, but it comes together here in this perspective of supporting staff and supporting risk management, undertaking both that positive and constructive criticism, supporting people to build on their strengths and enhance areas of challenge, one of the pieces, one of the quotes that we hear fairly regularly from people is, common sense isn't actually that common. The way that I like to look at it is your idea of common sense may be different than somebody else's idea of common sense. So everybody has their own perspective of common sense, but they're not always coming from the same place, the same background, in that it would align with yours. So sometimes you do have to talk about things that feel like they are common sense to you. And then on the other side of the yin yang, these policies and procedures as risk management practice for the organization. So quite often we have a bit of a spectrum here, and it looks like perhaps it's a bit more difficult to see the right side of it on the screen, but I'll talk our way through it. You have on your far left the majority of people who will understand and follow your policy and meet expectations, and you don't necessarily have to address HR policies and procedures very often. You have some people for whom some direct management is necessary to understand and comply. And then on the far right, you have your smaller group that causes risk, and your smaller group that, again, needs more support with that. And we often talk about the 80-20 rule when you're thinking about HR. Quite often, 20% of the people take up 80% of the time that you spend focusing on HR. I've just reiterated that quote about common sense, and want to mention what you're going to find is, as we speak our way through this webinar, you're going to have to think about your own organizational policies and practices, and that they take precedence over pretty much anything we say today, because each organization is going to have a different culture and approach as far as how much is documented in formal policy and how much is not, whether it's really a more informal way that practices come about. So think about that as you move forward and listen to the conversation that we're having today. And sometimes brand new managers and leaders have a bit of an urge to policy everything. I'm not sure if policy is actually a verb, but I'm going to use it that way. And I would encourage particularly first-time leaders to fight that urge a little bit and think about sometimes what might happen is you have to deal with something with an employee. You don't have a policy in place, so it was a really challenging conversation for you to get your bearings and get your ground underneath you as you had that conversation. And then a reaction to that might be, we just need a policy about this so that I don't have to deal with it in that way again. And you don't want a policy just to avoid sort of a situation with one individual. You really do need to think about, and again, the culture of your organization as far as how decisions are made about creating policy or not. So again, if what your organization does differs from anything that we say today, this really is your opportunity to think about that and maybe have a conversation within your organization to understand why that might be. So just want to put up a bit of a chart here to talk about what in fact does HR do. Sometimes that's mysterious to people who are outside of HR. Sometimes it's very, very well known. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a number of different subject areas that HR is involved with. I probably have missed some as well. On the right-hand side, you can see at what part of the organization or what level of focus they are involved. And it really depends. Again, your organization may have quite a robust human resource department, or your organization might have a very small human resource department, and that one individual or two individuals may have a very robust understanding, and yet they can't manage all of this in a really detailed fashion. So there's been some focus decided about what your HR staff do. Ideally, they're working at the strategic level, the operational level. They're looking at future planning, in particular related to recruitment and what the needs in the market might be. They're looking at current issues. They look at things at an organizational level and an individual level. And that generally applies to all of those topics on the left. So we're going to pause here just for a moment and get you to open your polls handout. Click on that link, and you're going to see this slide show up again, but it's going to show up in a fashion that you can take a moment and click on any area in this slide that you think your role overlaps with the role of the human resources staff. So we have a few folks voting right now, and in particular, lots of focus In the top of the circle, the areas that are health and safety, absolutely. Significant overlap there. Labor-employee relations makes sense for sure. Recruitment and selection, thank you. And we're getting more dots here. Payroll, training and development, performance management, employee wellness. Yeah, pretty much every place on this, as you've noted, there is some overlap. Now, we don't have a lot of dots on organizational design or succession and career planning. And again, depending on where you are in your leadership journey, you may be involved with that with human resources, and depending on where your organization is, if how they're doing that kind of work, you may or may not be involved with that. But clearly, there's a great deal of overlap here, so it's important for us as leaders and managers to think about that. I'm going to move into a fairly weighty slide, and thank you for your input to that. That's about hierarchy and independencies of sources of authority. So some rather long words there too. But what's really critical and why we wanted to go through this piece is to give you that really sort of 50,000 foot understanding of how legislation interacts with your policies, interacts with your actions as a manager, and some of the things that you need to think about how that works. So we're going to start at essentially the top of the hierarchy, and legislation overrides everything else, is the bottom line for legislation. So there's also a hierarchy in legislation. Provincial legislation that's in place can't contradict the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You're unlikely to have to navigate an issue at that level, but just important to know and understand it. And recognizing that since legislation overrides all else, it's not a bad idea to have a sense of what the Employment Standards Act is all about, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Human Rights Code, sort of all of these legislations that will impact you and your organization on a daily basis. Now, Maria says these are the things you want to read when you're needing something to help you to get to sleep. But you know, and it's also not something that you want to get so deep into that you necessarily have it memorized. But you can also have all of these as bookmarks on your computer at work, so that if you need to refresh yourself on something, if there's a question about something, you're going to talk to HR, but you also might want to have that opportunity to look at it and for yourself. Legislation doesn't change very regularly, obviously only through legislative act. So the Employment Standards Act has changed in the last couple of years. It's not carved in stone, it does change. It's usually a fairly big deal, and you hear a lot about it when it does. Case law may have interpreted or clarified legislation. Or may result in additional considerations. So it's not changing legislation. It's a place where people perhaps don't completely understand the legislation the way it was written, and some cases have gone to court that have provided some precedents related to that. The courts will assume that the employer, is always in a position of power when it is interpreting or clarifying. So that's from a risk management perspective. That's another way to think about why your policies may be written the way that they are. Because if something gets in front of a court of law, the assumption is the employer, and you as the manager represented the employer in interactions, that you were in a position of power and that the employee therefore may have been under some kind of duress related to any particular issue. So that's how you'll see some of this case law coming out. Another example of sort of how case law has added something into the equation, when we talk about termination and severance pay, termination pay is in the Employment Standards Act. That severance pay that often comes above and beyond the Employment Standards Act really comes out of common law. So somebody who's been with an organization less than a year, more than 3 months and less than a year, the Employment Standards Act says that they get 1 week's notice. In many cases, common law would result in you providing another additional week, another additional 2 weeks. Sometimes we hear people talk about 4 weeks being the norm once you add your Employment Standards Act and your common law together. That's not necessarily the case. So be a little bit careful about when people talk about norms, because quite often it depends on the particular situation. Professional college standards is next on our list. And of course, if it comes directly from legislation, it falls under number 1. So these sort of hierarchy, it's going down the hierarchy. And then really the last 2 things on the hierarchical legal risk are the 2 areas that you're going to be most engaged. So your organizational policy and your organizational practice. So again, we talk about, what would happen if you ended up in court dealing with a particular HR issue. And it's very rare that you end up in court dealing with an HR issue, but quite often as you're moving through the issue, that's the consideration in the back of your head is, if this went to court, would I have done the right things? Would I have followed organizational policy? Would our practices have been implemented properly? Gives you a little bit of that guideline of making sure you're taking the right steps as you go through. So your organizational policy cannot run against any of the 3 above items. If your policy doesn't match legislation, your policy would get thrown out the door if you ended up in that situation in court. If it contradicted professional college standards, it would be thrown out the door. And your organizational practice is also very interesting. So again, we talked about some organizations may have a great deal of policy. Other organizations may have less policy documented, but they have a very clear organizational practice that everybody follows. And that will stand up in court to a degree. If you say, this is the way we have always done things, we do it consistently with staff, staff are aware to it. It's not going to be as strong as if it was written in a policy, but it is backup that you can use to some degree, unless your practice is in contradiction with your policy. And then again, your policy will likely get thrown out. So we talk about cases where actually a really good example is in the health and safety realm. And this isn't even about court. This is about when a labor inspector comes to your organization or somebody gets hurt because they haven't been wearing, let's say you have an open-toed shoe policy. Somebody hasn't been wearing has been wearing open-toed shoes, has not been following the policy. The supervisor mentioned it to them once or twice, but never sort of escalated, never sent them home to get shoes, just sort of let it slide for the most part. And then they drop something on their toe, they break their toes. Ministry of Labor comes in. The supervisor says, well, we have a policy that said they were supposed to wear closed-toed shoes. The employee says, well, I wear open-toed shoes all the time, and my supervisor never really, they told me about it a couple times, but they never stopped me. In that case, it's considered your practice that you let people wear open-toed shoes, and both the individual and the organization will get, let's say, fined for that, and you as a supervisor can get personally fined because you weren't following the organizational policy. So those 2 things really interact with each other, and it's important to realize that. We're going to move now into a scenario. So we've got a couple of little vignettes that we're going to do throughout the course of this afternoon. What I'd like you to do as you're watching the vignette is look for some of the red flags and think about where the organization has been exposed to risk in this scenario. I'd like to reintroduce Maria and take the opportunity. You all know Kathleen in some capacity, most likely over email, but many of you will not have met her in person before, and we're very grateful that she's participating in this scenario. And we have Maria as a manager and Kathleen as an employee, and I'll let you 2 go ahead. Thank you so much.
Oh, Kathleen. Good afternoon, Kathleen. I've scheduled this meeting to inform you that you didn't pass your probation. It's unfortunate that this has not worked out. I will be asking you to gather up your things. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. As you are still on probation, you will not be eligible for any termination pay or severance.
But I thought that the ESA says you have to provide at least 1 week's notice or pay in lieu of notice if I worked for you for more than 3 months, and I've been here for 5 months.
Actually, you started 4 months ago, and on your first day of work, I gave you your employment agreement and you signed it. It states that for your first 6 months, we're probation and we could let you go without notice. Further, you have not been performing all of your tasks in your job description, and the ones you are performing, the quality is not at the expected level.
But you never even gave me a job description or told me that my quality wasn't good. You kept saying that it was fine. I'll be talking to my lawyer about whether you owe me some kind of severance for this.
And scene. Thank you very much, Maria and Kathleen, for that. So we're going to ask you to go to your polls again and just spend a few moments telling us what you think the areas of risk are in that conversation and the actions that the manager has taken. This is one of those polls that you can start typing a response, and then if you see a response that you agree with or you quite like, you can vote and get it sort of to push up to the top. So hopefully you that didn't go by so quickly that you didn't have a chance to think about it. And we've got some folks responding, so thank you. So yes, no job description. It's very difficult to hold somebody accountable to tasks that they may or may not know they're responsible for. So we've got lots of folks weighing in on that particular one, and very much appreciated. Not using progressive discipline. Yep. So not having said at any point in time, you know, your quality isn't working. Can we find a different way to do it? Even during that probationary period, really using that time, that probationary period, to give the individuals all the tools to be successful, and then see how that works out. The employment letter was signed the first day of work, and it should be signed prior to starting. So that's something that not a lot of people realize, and thank you to those of you who mentioned it and have voted on it there. Yes, if Kathleen does take this to a lawyer, the first thing the lawyer is going to say is, your employment agreement, we can fight that because you signed it under duress. You'd already started at the organization, maybe you gave up another job to start there. And then they asked you to sign on to these terms and conditions when you were already in the door doing the job. So that's a fantastic note. No feedback on performance given prior, absolutely. And insufficient feedback, very similar. Not meeting during probationary period, absolutely. Probation is to support you and the organization, or the employee and the organization. No probationary period review, did not provide feedback. Supervisor provided feedback during probation. Yeah, so I think, thank you so much. I think you caught all of the things, and maybe even a little bit more than what I wanted to make sure we talked about in our scenario debrief. And I went away from the flower metaphor for the picture for the debrief, because really, to me, that particular conversation was a real hornet's nest of issues. And you addressed all of them as you looked at it and thought about what some of the issues are. So thank you so much for doing that. And I won't go through the debrief because you were right on top of all of the issues, excuse me. So we're going to turn to a new topic now, and we want to talk a bit about progressive discipline, which some of you mentioned as you responded to that particular scenario. So again, there's some caveats here about progressive discipline and what I'm about to talk about. In particular, your organization's policy and procedure may be different than what I'm talking to you about. So overriding rule is know and understand how your organization deals with progressive discipline. What I'm providing is an example of how it may often work in organizations. We're going to start at the left-hand side of the screen. And one of the most critical pieces for you, particularly knowing that many of you are new and emerging leaders, you might be in your first time in a supervisory role or a management role, you do really need to understand what is in your span of authority as far as progressive discipline goes. In some organizations, they may say the supervisor should give a verbal warning, and if they're moving to a written warning, then they should escalate that to their manager. Some organizations might say, you know, you can go much farther down the list before you escalate it. It probably depends on what your management position is and how many layers of management are in the organization. So it's absolutely critical that you understand what you're expected, how far you're expected to take progressive discipline on your own, and when you need to seek help. So I'll go through, again, a fairly standard escalation process for progressive discipline. And I'm going to start with the verbal warning. And want to note that sometimes before you even do a verbal warning, there's been an informal conversation that isn't actually technically part of the progressive discipline process. However, if you do start with that informal conversation, it's still very important to document that you did that. And the best way I found to do that is a follow-up email, CCing yourself so that you can file it away. Just saying to the individual, you know, we had a conversation today about this issue. This is not a disciplinary step. I just want to make sure that we have the same understanding of the conversation that we had. And you can also state that we may need to move into the disciplinary process if this issue happens again. Sort of often the first formal step is a verbal warning. And again, a verbal warning is a meeting, a face-to-face conversation, but it should always be followed up with that email stating, you, as we discussed, you received a verbal warning. Here's the conversation that we had. And you can tell them that when you're in that conversation. I'm going to send you a follow-up email. That doesn't mean this is a written warning. It just means I want to make sure we're on the same page as to the conversation that we had and how that worked. You can give people an opportunity in that email to say, if this is not the same as your understanding of our conversation, then you need to let me know so that if you need to have further conversation, if you need further clarification, you can do it. Although what you don't want to do is put yourself in a position where it feels like it's a negotiation as to what the verbal warning was about, because it's not a negotiation, but it is potentially an opportunity for them to say, well, I need clarification on something. Quite often we move to a written warning phase after that. Again, that's handing a written warning to them in person, discussing the written warning. Usually you'll have a standard format to do that where they sign to acknowledge they received it. Again, you may wish to follow up with an email if there was discussion that was relevant in that process of handing that written warning. Very often from there, it moves to a suspension. The question often is how long of a suspension. Sometimes I've been in a situation where we did a 1-day suspension, and then something else happened a few months later and we did a 3-day suspension before we moved beyond that. So this is all discussion, and quite often when you get to the suspension, for sure, and I would say when you get to the written warning, it's absolutely not something that you should be doing on your own, whether you're getting support from HR, whether you're getting support from management, whoever is there. Again, understanding that span of authority, whoever is there to support you in that really needs to be very clearly involved in this. The date of the suspension, sometimes you can state what it is going to be. Sometimes you feel comfortable negotiating it with the individual, but recognize that if you're negotiating it, the individual may be just looking to get a long weekend out of it, and that may not actually be the intent that you're looking for when you're in a disciplinary process. And then often the final step, really the only final step that you can have, no matter how many steps you have, is the termination step. Why it's important for you to make sure other people are involved as you're moving through this process is, again, it's very difficult to have an ironclad with cause termination, even if you followed your way through this process. If a person believes that it wasn't done properly and they take it to a lawyer and they sort of suggest they might be willing to take it to court, your organization may choose to find an agreement rather and actually pay more or pay something rather than try to prove with cause, because it would be more costly to try and prove it. It would take more time and energy. It would be stressful, and the amount that they might have to pay might be worth sort of just ending the issue. So if you think you have a with cause termination, you think you followed the steps of the organization, you got all of the advice you needed along the way, and then you find out that they're actually providing severance, they're not calling it with cause, don't feel that that's something that you've done wrong, don't feel that the organization isn't following its own policy. That's really where the risk management has come into play, and decisions have been made related to risk management. On the far right, we just have a couple of things to always remember, no matter where you are in this process. Again, clarify who in your organization needs to be aware of or involved or lead the process. Always ask if there's anything that the staff member needs that you should be aware of. So you don't have to use the word accommodation, but again, something that has occurred is somebody's gone through a process, gotten to a termination place, and then the individual has said, well, I needed an accommodation because of a particular health issue, a particular mental health issue, a particular physical issue, and the employer says, well, you never told us that. There have been cases where the employee has said, well, you should have known or you should have asked, and the court agreed with them. So again, recognizing again that the court is always going to look at you as the employer as being in a position of power, and that you do need to ask those questions and recognize when it might be there. And again, document anything you may want to refer to later regarding the conversations that were had with this individual related to this particular progression as you moved through it. I want to mention before we move to performance as well, the importance of getting HR involved early, getting your manager involved early, in particular related to how things are documented. And again, that doesn't mean it's always going to be perfect. HR often learns lessons because of ways that things are written. And an organization that I worked with, somebody went through a discipline process. The manager in HR thought that they'd done an excellent job of moving their way through the process. The individual received 3 written warnings, and every written warning said, the next time this happens, you will be terminated. Second written warning, the next time this happens, you will be terminated. Third written warning, the next time this happens, you will be terminated. And then they terminated the individual. And while the perspective of the organization was, we gave them so much notice, we helped them so much, we tried to get them through this. Like, look, we did 3 written warnings before we terminated. That shows that we were trying to support them. And what the court said was, in fact, by giving them 3 warnings where each time you said the next time it happens, you'll be terminated, and not terminating them until 3 letters later, you gave them the message that you were never going to terminate them. And they relied on, well, I'm just going to get another written warning that says you may be you will be terminated next time. So there's language that you really want to be careful around how you use speaking to your progressive discipline. And most organizations have that fairly well down pat as far as describing the progressive discipline, pointing to the policy, saying we may move to the next step, and saying we always reserve the right to move to termination if it's a significant enough breach. So just another sort of practical piece to be aware of there. And from progressive discipline, it makes sense to move to performance and talk a little bit about performance because quite often those two things intertwine fairly significantly. And I put some definitions up because when we got the feedback from you folks, there was lots of different terminology used, and recognizing that those terminologies mean different things. So performance management, I'll use that terminology to describe the ongoing feedback and guidance direction to support growth and development and correction of concerns. And performance management may include a number of pieces. May include progressive discipline, as we just spoke about, may include a performance review. Some organizations do not do formal performance reviews. Many organizations do. So again, you need to look at your own organization's policies. But if you do a performance review in your organization, it really is a point in time opportunity to reflect over a past time period and develop goals and objectives for a future time period. Really important, which I think probably everybody is aware of, but when you're doing a performance review, nothing should be a surprise really to either party. If you've documented something, you should have talked to the individual about it. If you've thought about something that they need to improve, you should have had that conversation. If you are congratulating them for a success, you should have done that at some point earlier in the year as well. and that as goals, objectives, and strategies are set, they really should be, and this is where I think we all sometimes struggle. Sometimes we set our goals and objectives, set them aside, and pull them out just in time for the next review. And it's important that as a supervisor, manager, leader, and the employee, take accountability for pulling that out regularly, talking about it, seeing what other supports are needed, renegotiating it if necessary, if the situation has changed, to support that person in coming into the next review, being able to say, yes, I did accomplish what we had here because I was well supported to do it. And then a performance management plan. So that is a specific plan related to issues. It requires targeted development, and it's going to be closely monitored and followed up. So somebody has either had a fairly significant concern that's come up for a second time, or they've not passed their performance review because not satisfactorily passed because of particular issues. You want to provide this person something above and beyond the normal level of support and interaction that you do. You want a documented plan, again, both to outline the expectations, to outline what support you're going to provide, to have something that has that regular check-in. And again, from a risk management side, you may need to say to that individual, this is a significant issue and your employment could be terminated. We really need to work our way through this plan together and resolve these issues. So there's a checklist here of some of the things to think about. You want to make sure, as usual, that your goals are SMART goals, as far as being able to really articulate when and it's been successful, or whether it's not been successful. And certainly you can also use it in concert with progressive discipline. That's not uncommon in organizations. So we're going to do our second scenario now. And in this scenario, we're coming in partway through a discussion. The manager is wrapping up a performance review for an employee. They're sort of in the last 5 minutes of that discussion. It may have been a little bit of a challenging discussion, and I will now invite Maria and Kathleen to share that with us. Thank you.
As you can see from the discussions that we've just had about your review, there are many areas in which you excel and are accomplishing expectations at a very high level. The data for you pulling for grant writing is spot on as far as what is needed. You're an excellent writer, and the people that you work with report that you are collaborative and ensure that their point of view is included in the development of the grants. The challenge that continues to crop up is meeting timelines. As you will recall, we've had informal discussions about this. And then in August, I provided an official verbal warning. Other people have noted, as they provided feedback for you in this review, that they very much appreciate how collaborative you are and your skills in writing. They too, though, have been impacted at times when deadlines have crept up and you approach them in the results and they scramble to get you what you need. If you recall, just last week, you sent me a grant review at 9 p.m. at night, and it was due at 8 a.m. the next morning, leaving us no time for course correction if it was necessary. Are these comments fair? Do you agree that this is a challenge?
Well, yes. I know I've been late getting things to people as I prepare grants, but I'm just so busy, and so is everybody else. Sometimes they don't have time to meet with me when I need them to, or a grant will come in at the last minute and it throws off all of my plans.
Okay, so you have concerns that it's sometimes factors that don't feel that you have control that cause missing the deadlines. However, being able to prioritize, work under pressure, and meet tight deadlines is part of your job description. So we need to find a way for you to successfully navigate these things. You have currently not successfully passed your performance review as a result of this issue. I also have here for you a written warning for the incident last week. You and I will also need to develop a performance management plan to assist you in successfully overcoming this challenge.
Are you going to fire me?
My goal is to help you succeed. This is very serious in that our organization can't continue meeting our mission without grant funding in the work that you do is essential for that. I do need to be clear that resolving this issue is critical to your continued employment with us. Again, though, my intention is to work with you to avoid needing to move to that step. I'm going to give you a list of things that need to be the goal of the plan. Things like having a final draft of a grant application ready for review 24 hours before it is due. I'd like you to think about what tools and resources you need and steps to get you through that every time. We'll get back together to ensure that the plan is being met and troubleshoot any challenges you have. We'll meet bi-weekly for the next 3 months so that I can continue to provide support. Questions about this right now?
No, I guess I just need some time to really think about this, and I'll be prepared to discuss it further and how to avoid it in the future when we get back together on Thursday.
Great, thanks.
Thanks very much, Maria and Kathleen. So this time we're just going to do a very quick poll. We're hoping that, again, click on your link to polls document. And if you could just tell us on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you think the manager did in using this performance plan as a supportive tool? And as the votes are coming in, it looks like we have a pretty strong lead on the very supportive side of things. So thank you for that. It's an opportunity to think about, you know, how, if you were having this conversation, how would you have had it? Where are the things that you feel that Maria, or the script that Maria had, did a good job in sort of moving it into that higher support level? And what are the things that you think could have happened in that conversation to make it feel more supportive? If you felt, as a few folks did, that it was a 2, maybe a 3 out of 5 from that support perspective. And let's move, we've got one more on a scale of 1 to 10. How do you think the manager did in addressing the risk situation associated with what was being discussed there? So again, we have sort of our strongest vote there is for very well, with a few folks thinking that maybe there's some things that could be improved there. Again, it's that opportunity to think about what would you have done? How would you have made sure that you, or how will you when you're in this situation? Because at some point in your career as a leader or manager, you likely will be. What are the things that you would do potentially differently? How are you going to balance that out? And, you know, I would like to acknowledge some of the pieces in there, like having the conversation and then saying, we'll circle back to it and talk again on Thursday, given that today is Monday. I think both from a risk perspective and from a supportive perspective, giving the person time to think about it a little bit, but making sure you're coming back fairly quickly and addressing it quite quickly. Sometimes in the moment, an employee doesn't really know what to say. So giving them that opportunity to reflect is important. It also gives you an opportunity, you know, these conversations are challenging no matter how experienced you are at having them. So you plan what you need to say, you sort of have your list in front of you of the points you need to make sure that you make. And then afterwards you do a bit of reflection, and if you've set up a second appointment, it also gives you that opportunity to say, you know, maybe I didn't do as well on the risk side as I should have. I want to make sure I address that now. Maybe I could have been a little bit more supportive. How am I going to do that in this second conversation? And of course, the second conversation being a coming together and creating that plan together, so that the individual has had the opportunity to reflect, has developed some strategies themselves. And then you are also, as the leader manager, saying, these are the expectations we need to meet. So let's figure out our plan to do it. So thank you very much again, Maria and Kathleen. And Maria, before we move on to accommodations, I saw
Yes.
from you, there's a question. I just can't see it myself, so I'll let you.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. That's the question is, when you were talking about suspension, are they paid while on suspension?
That's a really good question, and it's something that each organization is going to make a decision for themselves about. And I think, there's multiple options. Certainly, we see instances, particularly where unions are involved, where a suspension is because they're trying to figure something out. It's not actually a discipline issue yet, but the question is, did this actually happen? Quite often, those are paid suspensions because you're not disciplining the individual. When it is discipline, my experience is that in the vast majority of the time, it is unpaid because the idea is related to, it's clear that something that's against policy has happened. It's clear that something has gone wrong. You are trying to put this individual in a situation of a bit of discomfort in order to impress on them how important it is. So yeah, I think it's something, quite often when I did a privacy course with a lawyer who gave me a hat that said, it depends. And when you're getting to sort of that level of specificity, it depends often on the situation, but it also depends, again, on the policies, practices, and procedures of your organization. And what are you trying to accomplish with the suspension? So absolutely involve HR in that discussion, involve your manager, supervisor, superior in that discussion, and look at, you may have that very well documented in your organization already. So I recognize that's a little bit of a wishy-washy answer, and you probably would have liked a yes or a no to that, but unfortunately that's not where HR and these kinds of things often are. So thank you for the question though. And Maria, feel free, because I can't see the question box, feel free to jump in and ask any other questions that might arise. So we'll move a couple slides down. We did the scenario in the poll, and now we're hitting the topic that was asked about accommodations. And there may have been very specific questions about accommodations. There was one person who specified what they were looking for related to accommodations. Other folks just used the word accommodation. So it's going to be a very broad and general overview that I'm going to give you here related to accommodations. But I've also put a link at the bottom of the screen that takes you to the Ontario Human Rights Commission that provides a lot of good information, Q&As, FAQs on all sorts of questions about accommodations. So I would encourage you to go there if there's more information that you're looking for. So really the goal of the legislation is to ensure that someone that can work is able to do so. That's sort of the bottom line goal of the legislation, that as many people in Ontario who are able to work have the opportunity to do so. The question really comes into play when it's, again, your organization, the particular things you do in your organization, and the specifics of what the individual needs in order to be accommodated. And the real point that comes out there, what I'm sure everybody has heard of this terminology, is that an organization is responsible to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. Undue hardship to the organization. The issue, and what you need a magic wand to figure out, is what does undue hardship mean for your organization? What does it mean in any particular case? And unfortunately, even with all the great information that's on that website, you are not going to get a hard and fast answer to that either. It really depends on the size of the organization, for example. So an organization with a $20 million budget that needs to buy $1,000 worth of equipment for somebody with low vision to be able to do their job, it's going to have a really hard time convincing anybody that that $1,000 purchase is an undue hardship and they can't do it. On the other hand, a much smaller organization may have a different threshold. $1,000 might be the threshold that's considered undue hardship. Having to hire multiple people to cover different components of a job may be considered undue hardship. It's it's sort of that terminology is the bane of many HR people's existence, because it really takes sort of your best consideration of all of the aspects to decide whether you've reached the point of undue hardship or not. And frankly, if you think you cannot accommodate somebody, in my opinion, that's a conversation with an HR lawyer to make 100% sure that they would also agree that you probably have reached the point of undue hardship. The thing that relates to that is this term that is bona fide work requirements. So if you have to accommodate somebody, really it's about accommodating them against their job description. What are the things in their job description that they can no longer do, or that they need different supports in order to be able to do? And if you say that it's undue hardship for me to hire somebody, let's say you have a job description with a position that says somebody needs to have a driver's license and be able to drive. You have an internal candidate who wants to post into that position, but for reasons of some sort of disability, they cannot have a driver's license, they cannot drive. You say, well, it's part of the job description, therefore you cannot post into that position. They could look at that and say, you know, they could take that to a lawyer who would say, is driving really a bona fide work? Is it an actual work requirement? So the last person you had in that position had to drive to a location across town once every 2 weeks. Is it absolutely necessary if you're in London, where there's public transit, where there's access to taxis, et cetera, is it absolutely necessary that that person needs to drive themselves? Or have you sort of translated the bona fide work requirement, which is going to a meeting at another location, you've translated that into needing to have a driver's license, and it's not actually the case. So you really want to think and question some of those things you have in your job descriptions that may be keeping people from being able to apply to them, that aren't really true requirements of the job, so bona fide true requirements. One of the specific questions we got was, if somebody's injury is not work-related, do you still have a duty to accommodate? And quoted from that, the Ontario Human Rights Commission website, duty to accommodate employees with disabilities, the ... was just more confirmation kind of words, still applies, even if their injury is not work-related. So something else to think about there. What the Human Rights Commission does not define is whether a temporary injury is a disability. So again, your Human Resources Department, your policies, your procedures, you need to think about what can you accommodate, what can you not accommodate, what becomes undue hardship. And if it's a temporary injury, in particularly if you have sick benefits, short-term disability, long-term disability benefits, it is, you know, really that's the best opportunity to support them in their healing without actually having to accommodate. The challenge comes when you have people who would be without pay if they had an injury and were not able to work. But the Human Rights Commission suggests, at least, that you do need to attempt to accommodate that. And then the other specific question that was asked there is about right to privacy versus transparency. You know, when can I tell other staff that somebody is on an accommodation, recognizing that quite often it can cause some stress and strain in a team if somebody's given more admin times, a clinical person's given more admin time because they need it for a particular reason for an accommodation, but everybody else, all they see is that they get more admin time. And my sort of default for that is to have a conversation with the employee and understand what are they comfortable with you sharing and what are they not comfortable with you sharing. At the bottom line, I have had an HR lawyer tell me that you can say there are accommodations at play, and then you need to say, and it's not something I can talk to you about. I personally am not even comfortable saying there's an accommodation unless the employee knows that I'm going to share that piece of information and at least make that statement. And in many cases, employees actually want to have the conversation with their teams so that it doesn't cause stress and strain if people notice that they have different requirements. We're just going to move into our last slide before we wrap up here. We're about 5 minutes out. And just wanted to throw in a few more practical tips that didn't necessarily fit precisely into where we had them, the topics that we looked at. One of them that I think is extremely important to have an understanding of, that I find that organizations don't often talk about with new supervisors and new managers, is the concept of office files, and that idea that you as a supervisor manager have the right to have files in your office where you're documenting conversations or issues or making notes about the individual people who report to you, so that you can rely on it later when you think about, again, I had this verbal conversation, I noticed this behavior, I think it's time to talk about it, or this conversation didn't go very well and they were aggressive. So that you can also pass those things along to, if you move into a different position and another supervisor comes along, they don't have to start from scratch. They have some understanding of where you are in the process of, supporting people with a particular behavior, what have you. Make sure you date them. Ideally, write them in the moment or write immediately after the moment, because if you ever need to rely on them in the future, they become stronger evidence if you've written them in the moment. Please make sure you don't do this unless you have a secure place for them. Some suggestions being a locked file that only you have the key to. A strategy that I started using as I got more and more comfortable with email is emailing myself and having folders in my email box that I would put these in, so I knew they were secure on our secure system electronically. Nobody might stumble across them. Also, office files can be subpoenaed. So again, you're not going to end up in court on a regular basis, but just from that risk management perspective, as you're writing them, think about them as something that somebody else may eventually read someday, because they can be subpoenaed if you are in that kind of a situation. And one suggestion that I have, because I think from that perspective of compassion and empathy, quite often we see a small issue. Say somebody was a little bit less respectful than you're used to seeing them being, but it wasn't a significant issue. It was clearly, you've been working with them for 10 years, you've never seen them do that before. You know that they have some sort of strain in their personal life right now. You decide not to address something for whatever reason. I would still document it in the file as sort of something that happened, so that again, if it happens again a couple of months later, it's a reminder to you, okay, this has already happened once and I didn't address it. I really must step forward and address it this time. Or if it comes back that somebody says, why didn't you address that person being disrespectful? You didn't even notice it. You know for yourself that you did notice it and that you made a conscious decision. Again, as I talked about in accommodations, but anything personal, ask before you share it. I know there's often in organizations, when somebody's off on a sick day, sort of that's the email that goes out. So-and-so is off on a sick day. I've had somebody ask me before to please not share why they were off when it was a bereavement leave. And I know, again, some people just automatically sort of share that it's a bereavement leave because you know that there's empathy that people are going to want to apply. Perhaps the better strategy is to just always say that so-and-so is off for the day, full stop, unless they've given you permission. Don't promise or threaten and not follow through. I told you the story of the 3 letters that said somebody would be terminated. Consistency with the individual and across individuals is key. It's only differing circumstances that you should be inconsistent. And in fact, you're not being inconsistent because the circumstances are different. And when to consult with HR whenever you are uncertain. The final bullet is our original message repeated. And we are almost out of time here, but that got me to the end of the slide. So I'll hand it back over to Maria to wrap up. Thank you.
Great. Carrie, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I'm mindful of one question that we will answer and send the response out to participants just because of our time. I want to also thank Kathleen. Kathleen, do you want to come on just so people can see you when you're not incognito? There she is. So thank you, Kathleen. And of course, thank you to Carrie. For those of you who are doing the webinar, the questions, I won't go through them here. But they are up, and Kathleen has them on the portal, so you have the information for them there. So thank you again. We'll end with our final poll like we do normally. We want to get a sense of what this was like for you. And so the question is, one word to describe how you're leaving our session. As always, there's just so much more to share, but we wondered if you could let us know how this was. And we'll see you in a month. So thank you. Thank you. Love that. Carrie rocks. Yes, she does. Regrets. Yeah. Well, thank you again, everybody. We will see you in a month for our webinar series on evaluation, another important topic. We'll just let the words finish off as people are leaving.